So we're going to start the conversation on Azure Storage. And here's one simple fact to start with. Whenever I talk about Azure Storage, I usually start with one principle that we can all agree on, and that is there are different kinds of data in the world. And the reason why I start with this will make sense to you as we go on. The different kinds of data in the world. What do I mean by that? For example, let's say I'm running a virtual machine and my virtual machine is providing web services. So just a simple web service virtual machine. If I have users, which I want users to be accessing my website, they probably need to access some form of image, some form of videos or anything like that. That's a different types of data. That's a different type of data. And most likely I'll be storing that on a storage somewhere, maybe on a network share, file share somewhere, on a type of storage, that's where I'll be storing that. Also, my user that accessing my website, they probably have usernames and passwords. And hopefully I'm not storing my users' usernames and password on the same storage that I'm storing the videos and images, because this is a different type of data. Maybe this will go into a SQL database somewhere, a relational database somewhere, or a NoSQL, or somewhere. It's going into a database somewhere, some other identity store, usually. But let's just say I'm using like a relational database for that. It's a different type of data. And that's the premise that we have to start from to understand Azure Storage, is that there are different kinds of data in the world. And what Microsoft have done with what they call the Azure Storage account is to take that into account. So when we talk about Azure Storage account is the main service that have multiple sub-services under it. And the multiple sub-services that it has under it helps when you're talking about or dealing with different types of data. So let's take that home a bit. Let's make that help that to make sense. I think there's a little bit of background noise a bit. Yeah. So it's not too much, but it's a little bit of background noise. So if we mute the mic, that will help. Thank you. So let's having understood that fact, let's go to what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna start by showing. So let's go draw. This is an Azure Storage Account service. I said there are different types of data in the world. Azure Storage Account takes this into consideration, and it is the main service that has multiple services under it. And what are the services that Azure Storage Account has under it? Number one is it has a service called the Azure Blob service. So let's get that on the board here, the Azure Blob service. And Blob stands for binary large objects blob. So what that means is we're talking about object-based storage. And that is talking about anything that you consider to be an object, a file, a virtual hard drive, an audio file, a video file, an Excel spreadsheet, whatever. If it's a file, if it's an object, you store it. One of the services under the Azure Storage account that you can use to store it is the Azure Blob service. It's a sub-service under the Azure Storage account, Azure Blob service, and that is binary large object-based storage. Now, when we talk about blob, there are different kinds of blobs that exist. So, number one, when we talk about blob, is we have a type of blob referred to as the page blob. And I'll just remove the blob, I'll just say page. And the whole premise again behind pages, it's optimized for, so let's go outside here. So I'll just go page blob. The thing about page blob is it's optimized for random access. Is there any kind of object that you can think of, or any kind of data that you can think of that requires random access? Videos? No, not really. There's another one for video.
The Windows page
So
Databases.
VHDs.
excellent, that's it. VHDs. So for example, if you want to access your virtual hard drives, right? It's not as if it's like a sequential access. You could access, a block somewhere here, another block over there. So it's random access. You're accessing the data randomly. It's not like something that there's a sequence to it or there's a kind of like a pattern to it or something. It's random. So whenever you need to store anything that like random that requires like random access, you saw them as a page blob under the blob service because page blobs are optimized for random access. There's another type of blob called the block blob. And block blobs are optimized for sequential access. Anything that you can think of that requires sequential access. So for example, you're accessing something from the beginning all the way to the end, from the beginning all the way to the end.
That'd be like music videos kind of thing.
Excellent. Yep. So things like that. So things like your media, music files, your audio files, your video files, or something like that. Occasionally, of course, you can access them. You can do like maybe skip from the beginning to the end, but that's not the typical way you access them, right? If the way you listen to music every single time is you go from the beginning, you jump to the middle every single time, then it's like, okay, what's going on here? You can do that like once in a while, but that's not like your normal mode of accessing that is you read it all the way from the beginning to the end. You read it all the way from the beginning to the end. Block blobs are optimized for that type of access. And then finally, there's another type called the append blob. Append blob is actually like a modified form of the block blob because what it's optimized for is once you create it, you don't really need to create more. You just need to keep adding data to an existing file. Any thoughts on what kind of data? So once you
Like log files, things like that.
excellent,
Database.
that's it. So database is coming. So in this one, because this one is the reason why database is not here, by the way, is because database is not typically considered to be an object. This is being something that's an object like a file that you can pick and drag and drop or whatever. So this would be something like your log files would be what you'll be using something like this for. So that's just under like the Azure Blob storage. That's a Blob service. It's a service under the Azure storage account. The reason why all of this will make sense also is I teach the Azure architecture course, and one of the main confusions that I've found, I've seen this confusion a lot because this is probably like one of the most popular services on the Azure storage account. And I've seen people read documents and they just interpret Azure storage account to be Azure Blob. And people get confused. So they're trying to interpret something that should apply to Azure storage and try to interpret that for Azure Blob. Azure Blob is a service under Azure storage account, but it's not the only service. There are multiple other services that could exist under an Azure storage account. We'll get to the other ones. So the thing about Blob service is how is it accessed? Blob service, binary large object, it's accessed over HTTP or HTTPS. So if you want to access anything that you're storing in this service, you have to come in and access it using HTTP or HTTPS. That can kind of like be an issue if your application is a legacy application that's been designed to work for something like SMB. So what that means is you need to rewrite your application. If you're a developer, you need to modify it to now begin to take advantage of Blob because Blob can be accessed over HTTP and HTTPS, but your application is written to access files over SMB or something like that. So that leads us to the second service under the Azure storage account. And the second service is a service called the Azure File Service. An Azure File Service, it's very similar to Blob in that it's object-based storage also. So Azure File Service, it's also object-based storage. So the file service is also object-based storage. So which means that many things that we just described that you can store on the blob, you can actually store them on file also because they're just objects. The main difference is how they are accessed. Azure File Service, anything stored in that, can be accessed over SMB. So over our traditional network shared, right? So that's one of the main differences of that. Is you can access this over SMB, whereas this one you can access it over HTTP, HTTPS only. You can also access this one over HTTP, HTTPS using REST API, but the main other advantage is that you can access it over SMB. So which means that if you're storing something on this one and your application is only designed to access things over SMB, you don't need to rewrite the application because this also speaks SMB. So it's object-based storage also. And I'll show you like some quick information about this. So actually, I'll come back to Azure Blob. Let me show you Azure File very quickly because that may be a very straightforward one to show you. So I just deployed, before we started, I deployed a file server over here. So what I'll do is I'll go to um, virtual machines and I'll go to the file server that I just deployed. And by the way, if you have a look, the auto scaling that I was showing you earlier, so it probably sent me a lot of email. It scaled as much as it could scale. So I think I'm up to how many instances now? Yeah, I'm up to 3 instances now. So I think I need to go stop all of this now. And so let me go get the public IP login to this file server and show you how Azure File Service works and how simple it is, how easy it is. So log into this file server, or it could be any endpoint as long as it's an endpoint that speaks SMB. That's fine. So, and while it's loading up, what I'll do is I'll go to create a resource. I'll just go to create a storage account. I won't cover anything that I'm doing because I'll come back to all the other things that I'm doing. I just want to create one very quickly. Put that there. I'll call this DO for my initials, store 909. Yeah, that's available. I'll put that in UK South, and I'll just leave everything else. We'll cover all of this later. So it should take less than 30 seconds to create because it's just giving you a chunk of the Azure storage cluster for you to use. So it doesn't take long to, it's not as if it's deploying any infrastructure or anything like that. It's just adding a configuration to a node. Go to finish deploying. I go to my resource, and here's where you can see my storage account. If I go to the left hand side, you can see the blob service. And if I scroll down, you can see the file service. And on the file service, if I go very quickly on the files, I can create a new file share. And look at this. Azure, Azure storage account can go up to 2 petabytes in some regions, 500 terabytes in some other regions in terms of the scale of one single storage account. But I can just create a file share now. Just call this share01. And I can call this, I can make this 500 gigabytes and create that. And look at that, that's done. Just within a second, I've just created a 500 gigabyte network share. And then I click on my share. I go on the connect. It's going to give me a PowerShell script or a command line script that I can go run on my machine. So it says, do you want to mount it if it's Windows, Linux, or Mac, whichever one you're using. It's gonna give us the command to use. So go on the Windows, I want to mount it as drive Z. I copy that PowerShell command, go into my file server, and I want to paste this command into Notepad because I want to modify something there. And what I'll do is I'll make this larger for you to see what's going on. So let's go, okay, and I'll do a word wrap. So um, so you can see that it has a key here. So that key is very important. I'll talk about that in a minute. It has a key, and then it's gonna try to connect to this, which is the name of my storage account, .file.core.windows.net. and it's specifying again the name of the storage account as the username and the storage account key as the password, and then it's mounting this drive. The only thing that I'll do is I'll add a persist parameter at the end. So then I copy this command, run PowerShell as an admin, switch to PowerShell and execute that. So it's just testing the connection, making sure that, and you see it's going over port 445, which is the normal network share port. And I mount that and it says it's done. I go to my PC, I go to this PC, and I have a 500 gig network share available to this. I can create files. So essentially, it's like the same as just a normal network share. If I go back to my storage account, refresh that, I have my file. So it's just a normal storage account, but you can see like how easy it is. I don't need to manage any operating system. I don't need to manage operating system updates. Just create this massive file share that's available to use. But that's the Azure File Service. I'll be talking a lot about the blob afterwards. But does that make sense to us, right? Both of these are object-based storage. Good. So let's go on to like other services. So there's another service called under the Azure storage account called the table service. And the table service, for those that are familiar with databases, it's what you consider a NoSQL database. And it's usually can take document-based NoSQL database. So things like JSON or even XML, I believe, but I think it's mainly recommended JSON now. So essentially, like document-based NoSQL database is what this is. And again, it's just available under the Azure storage account as another service that you can use. If I go to the storage account that I created earlier, and if I go back, if I go down, you have tables here, and that's the table service. And then finally, we have a service called the queue service. Well, not finally, because there's a little bit of a twist. We have a queue service. And what the queue service, what it does is for developers, if you're coming from a development world, there's this thing you call microservices. In other words, you have your application that is like a single monolithic application, a strong heavy application. And then you break down that application into smaller components. It's called decoupling. So you decouple the components of your applications. The advantage of doing that if you're a developer is you can fix or scale a different part of your application without affecting everything else, right? So it's a very good way. But when you now begin to decouple your applications, you have to have a way for the different components of the applications to talk to one another. One way is that developers usually do that is by utilizing something called a queue. So for example, an application, a component of your application has finished a process, wants to pass it on to another component of your application to carry on from there. It's going to put a message in a queue. And then the other component is busy reading the information from the queue and then processing things that way. And then it can finish its own processes and hand it over to another component of your application and put it in a queue. So that kind of messaging is what Azure Queue does. So object-based storage, NoSQL database, just messaging, application messaging is what that is. So that are the main services under the Azure storage account. There is a new addition to the list. This one is relatively a bit newer, and that is, again, if you're familiar with data services, it's Data Lake Gen 2. So it's a relatively new addition to this. So if you say Data Lake Gen 2, that means there must be a Data Lake Gen 1, and there is a Data Lake Gen 1. The thing is Data Lake Gen 1 was great, but here's the thing is that Azure storage account has massive scale. So Microsoft thought, how about we combine this great technology of Data Lake Generation 1 with the massive scale of the Azure storage account and hook both of those together. And that is exactly what they've done. So Data Lake Gen 2 is technology that Data Lake Gen 1 provides with the massive scale of Azure storage. And that's what this service provides. Now, this service utilizes Azure Blob. I'll explain what that means to you in a minute. Because if you enable this service, actually, I'll just show that to you. If I enable this service, it replaces the blob and I don't get all of this anymore. If I don't enable this service, then I get just the blob and I don't get this service. So essentially, if you want to enable this service, that means you've decided you're not using the blob service. You want to use this one. So that's the way that works. Okay, all of that makes sense before we talk about other aspect of the Azure storage.
Yeah.
Or any questions at
Yeah.
all? Yep. Okay, so what I'll do,
Sorry, Dave. Just a quick question. So,
yes,
on the sort of the file storage side of things,
yes.
Azure, Microsoft don't implement any form of AV file scanning or anything along those lines across that by default, do they? It's up to
No.
however you scan it from the host.
Yes, no. So no, they do not implement any form of AV scanning and the others. No.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So you need to either, like to your point, you either implement that or whatever host that you're using and implement that on that way. There was even like for the blob and the others. So the main thing that they implement for this is, which is great, is that they have it integrated with Azure Backup. So you can actually enable Azure Backup to back up Azure File. And that is sad because the only service on the Azure Storage account that you can integrate with Azure Backup is Azure File service. Azure Blob Service does not currently have a native integration with Azure Backup, which means essentially you have to figure out your own method, which isn't the best, right? But yeah. And also when it comes to cost, Azure File is typically more expensive than Azure Blob. So when it comes to object-based storage, again, it's like you're using something legacy. Typically, it's going to cost you more in Azure. That's the way that the public cloud works. I want to get you moving to the newest thing as quickly as possible. So, for example, if I go Azure pricing calculator and I go to have a look at add a storage account, add a storage account. And if I scroll down and I change this to Azure Blob, yeah, which is kind of like the equivalent of that one, and I'll just change that to UK South. Let's change the currency to pounds also. Oh, no, not Australian dollars. British pound is what we want. That's it. And blob and all of that. So that's 1 terabyte, about 14 plus all of the plus that plus that plus that. That is if you're using the standard storage. Essentially, that leads to about 1522 in a month. If I go ahead and I switch that to Azure File Storage, and that's the same 1 terabyte, but you notice that this is significantly higher. So that is 5592 versus 1522. So that's significantly more expensive. But again, you're using something like you're using legacy SMB, that's fine. You do that. And you find that kind of pricing model across Azure. I showed you yesterday with the virtual machines. You use the generation V1 machine. Actually, you're getting less resources or less resources, slower resources because they're legacy resources. And also it's going to cost you much more than if you use the newer versions, which will be faster. In some cases, they will even give you extra resources, but then they reduce the cost. So because they also want to update all the underlying technologies and they want people to move away from all this legacy to the newer stuff. So cost is the way to incentivize people in the public cloud. So, okay, so where was I? I was going to go back to start talking about, let's talk a little bit about accessing these services. Because let's say I create a storage account. I just created one called DO Store 909. That's the name that I gave it. What happens is for me to access these individual services under this storage account, I can access these on the DO Store 909.blob.core.windows.net. And on and on and on. if I want to access, what's the name? Oh, it's not good. So let's do that again. do store 909.blob.core.windows.net, and if I want to access a file, it's going to be the same thing, only that it's going to be .file rather than .blob, and it's going to be the same thing if I want to access the table service .table. And actually you can find this information if you go under the storage account, and if I go very quickly to storage account and I go back to my 909 storage account, and if I go on the properties, you'll see that information there. So I'll just make that a bit larger for you to see, but you can see that I'll explain what the secondary stuff is talking about. But you can see the file service endpoint .file.core.windows.net, the queue service endpoint .queue.core.windows.net, the table service endpoint, and that. So that's kind of like the access to them. So let's talk about other things. So I wanted to create a new storage account and talk about the other things that I didn't talk about earlier. So let's go storage. And number one, let's talk about the performance option. So you can see when you're creating an Azure storage account, you have the option to specify 2 tiers of performance, standard or premium. Anybody wants to guess what the difference between the two?
HDD and SSD.
Excellent, that's it. It's HDD, so that's HDD, that's SSD. So faster, HDD and SSD. So that's essentially what that is. So you can either choose HDD, which will be less expensive for performance-wise, slower, premium, which will be SSDs, but performance, which will be more expensive, but performance-wise faster. So you choose what type of storage account you want in terms of performance tier. In terms of storage account kind, I'll need to give you a little bit of history lesson. Because you see, when it comes to account kind, there are 3 main kinds you can select: storage version 2, storage version 1, and blob storage. In the past, we used to only have storage or version 1. There wasn't any version in front of it then, just storage and blob storage. And we'll play a little bit of a game here. Let's play spot the difference game. Let's say storage. If I select just storage version 1, I want you to notice I'm scrolling down as much as possible. And then if I change to blob storage, anything that you can notice that's different. Let me go back again. Storage version 1, I'm scrolling down.
The access tier.
Excellent. You have this one called the access tier here, cool or hot, that exists for blob storage, but if I change to storage, there's no access tier. So in the past, we used to have just storage kind or blob storage kind. So the main difference being this blob storage kind only supports blob, right? And it has the capability for this access tier. Access tier, essentially what they use that to determine is, in Azure, when you're paying for Azure storage, one of the 2 main things that you pay for is you pay for the cost of storing your data. So if you're storing 1 gigabyte, you pay for the cost of storing 1 gigabyte of data, but you also pay for the cost of accessing your data. So here's the thing is that when you talk about auth tier, when talking about blob storage, now when talking about the auth tier, what that means is that you're going to pay less for accessing the data, and you're going to pay more for storing the data. But when you go for the cold tier, you're going to pay more for accessing the data, and you're going to pay less for storing the data. And the whole idea behind that is if you had data that you don't really access, data that you want to archive off, and you have terabytes of them, or petabytes of them, or whatever, you just want to store them somewhere you don't really think you're going to be accessing them, except like an auditor comes around, some years down the line and stuff like that. you can save yourself a lot of money by moving those to a cold tier, because you're going to pay less for storing them, but you're not going to be accessing them anyway, so that's fine. But anything that you need to access, but if you need to access them, then they're going to charge you more for accessing them if they're in the cold tier versus accessing them if they're in the hot tier. That's the whole idea behind that. And that was a bit popular, but people were thinking, yeah, Microsoft, you only made this available for this. So Microsoft thought, how about we combine the capabilities of storage, general purpose, and blob storage, and we have storage version 2. Now you can see that we have access tier with this now. So we have all the capabilities of storage version 1, plus we have the access tier where we can configure the access tier to be cool or to be hot. So
David,
hello.
Are those access costs just for taking data out, or are they also for putting data in?
Good question. So I would say it depends. So if data is going into an Azure storage account, Microsoft don't charge you. So there's a few things that can get a bit confusing to people here. Let me draw some things out to help you. Remember that, let's say, okay, this is my, let's go back. This is my storage account, this one over here. Remember that if you're going to be doing anything, you're going to be going over a network anyway, right? So you're going to be going over a network. If you're bringing data and data is coming in over the network and flowing into this storage account, there's no cost for this. You can send as much as possible over the network as they're coming in. There's absolutely no cost to doing that. Send them over the network. That's absolutely fine. Now, if this same data starts going out over the network, there is a cost to that. And then you're going to get charged for that. But let me show you something else. If I go back to the pricing calculator that I showed earlier, if I go back on the storage account on the Blob, you notice that there is a cost for writing data. Can you see that? Write operations. 100,000 write operations will cost you this, right? Is that clear? Can you see that? 100,000 write operations. So what that means is you may not be charged for bringing this data in, but I'm going to be writing this data on this, and that's going to involve some write operations, and I'm going to get charged for that. Does that make sense to you? So even though you won't be charged for bringing them in over the network, that won't cost you anything, but the write operations may cost you. Notice I said may.
So there's no charge for the bandwidth. It's just
Exactly.
writing.
So yeah, exactly. So when it's coming in over the network, the bandwidth, no problems. But if it's going out over the bandwidth, yeah, you're going to be charged for that. Because all the cloud providers do that. Microsoft does that, AWS does that, Google Cloud does that. Many cloud providers want you to bring the data into the environment. They want to discourage you moving data out of the environment. So there's a charge to the bandwidth when data is going out. When it's coming in, there's no bandwidth charge to that. But remember that for certain types of storage accounts that you're creating, and depending on which service that you're using, the cost for write operations. So even though you may not be charged for that, for writing this on the actual storage on this one may actually incur some minimal cost. Does that answer your question? Yeah?
Yep. Thank you.
No problems. Okay, so where was I? I was talking about okay, storage account kind. So you have the access tier, you have the code or the odds. Now just version 2, you have the capabilities for both blob and that all mixed into one. Now I'll come back to replication in a minute. But I want you to pay attention to this. When I was talking about virtual machines yesterday, I talked about 4 key decisions when deploying a virtual machine in Azure. Anybody remembers what those 4 are? I'll give you number 1, images. Number 2,
Size.
the size. Number 3,
Type.
the size and the type. Same. Number 3, the disk. And number 4 is if you're going to be using extensions. So that's very good. So that's the 4 ones. When it comes to, and here's the thing is that even though I gave you like all those with Azure Compute, many of those things are changeable. You can change them afterwards. Like, I mean, if you create this particular size, you can choose another size afterwards. It's gonna restart, but that's not a problem for you. If that's not a problem for you, that's fine. So you can do that. When it comes to storage, 2 key decisions that you can make. One of them you cannot change afterwards. And I'll tell you. So number one is the performance and the account kind. Those are two key decisions. And you say, David, what impacts on what I select? Number one, if you select a standard storage account, you can go back to change it to premium. If you select premium, you can go back to change it to standard. Once you've selected the performance tier, you've selected the performance tier. That's it. Kind, you can still go so if you're on general purpose version 1, for example, you can upgrade to general purpose version 2 afterwards. So that's absolutely fine to do that. But what this also determines, what the combination of the performance and the kind that you select determines the services that are available to you in that storage account. That's so important that I've got to write it down. So for storage account, the combination of the performance and storage account kind determines the services that are available in that storage account. And this was so important because this was like a light bulb moment when I realized this. And I actually wrote a blog post on that because I did not find anything else that clearly highlighted it the way I used to highlight it in my whiteboard diagrams. So actually, if you go to my blog, there's a blog post that I that I actually had where I just took like my whiteboard diagrams on this when I teach like the architecture courses and stuff, and I just posted it in that blog because I didn't find it anywhere else. This is what I mean by that. Let me drag one of my whiteboard diagrams over here for you. If you have a look at this, so this is, let's make this 100% and let's go back. If I select the standard performance tier and I select the kind to be general purpose version 2, here are the services that I can use. Blob service, file service, table service, queue service. In other words, almost everything. If I select standard performance tier and I select general purpose version 2, and then I enable data lake. What do I mean by that? Let me show you very quickly. So what I mean is I select general purpose version 2 standard tier and I give it a name, store whatever. Hopefully that's good. Yeah. Standard general purpose version 2. Then I go to next and then I enable data lake gen 2. If I do that, here are the services that I'll get in this storage account. It's what I mentioned to you earlier. You get data lake gen 2 service, file, table, and queue. There's no more blob service because it's taken over by data lake gen 2. If you select standard and you select general purpose version 1, it's pretty much similar, but you notice that there's no data lake gen 2 for general purpose version 1. Now, if you select standard and you select the blob kind, these are the things that you get. You get blob and append blob options for this blob service. So what that means is if I go back again to show you very quickly, if I go back and I go previous, I go standard, but I select blob here, what I'll get is I'll only get blob service, but only blob and append blob. So that is for standard. If I go to premium, premium is a kind of a unique situation because premium only supports one service typically. If I select premium and I select general purpose version 2, I only get the blob service and only page blob. So this is something that's specific if you want to create virtual hard drives and you want to use SSDs for them and you want it to be unmanaged rather than managed disks. So you can create a premium storage account, select general purpose version 2, you get the blob service only for page blobs, and then you can upload your VHDs there. If you select premium and you select general purpose version 1, it's the same thing. If you select premium and you select block blob storage, you only get the block blob service only. If you select premium and you select file storage, you only get the file service. So premium is typically only one service. So, and just to show you that very quickly, if I go here and I select, change this to, what's the name? Let's change that back. And I go premium and I select that, I'm only getting page blobs. And I go select that, only page blobs. I select that, only blob. I select that, only file service. So just be aware of that. So a combination of these two determines the services that you can use within that storage account. And the performance, when you've selected, you cannot change that anymore. Make sense? Does that make sense before I move on to replication? Yeah, all good? Yeah, okay. So replication on the other hand, so one of the things you notice when it comes to replication of the Azure storage account, you do not have an option of no replication. You do not get that option. There's no, I don't want to do any replication. You always get replication. You cannot disable it. Now you can define what level of replication that you want, but you cannot disable it. So what that means is for this storage account, the lowest replication I can select is locally redundant storage. What does that mean by locally redundant storage? Here's what that means. Okay, here we go. That's our regions and our availability zone. So that's UK South and UK West in the UK geography. So here's the thing is that if I select locally redundant storage, LRS, locally redundant storage, what it's going to do is if I have my data, it's going to make 3 copies of my data and store it across 3 storage clusters within a single zone. And not until after these 3 copies are successfully stored will it send, with the Azure Storage Account Service, send a reply back to the client that requested the write operation to say the write operation is completed. In other words, you give the Azure Storage Service a data to store. It's going to replicate that data three times and store them across 3 separate storage clusters in an Azure AZ, and not until after all those 3 are successfully stored will it send a reply back to you to say all good. So that's that's the way that operates.
So does that triple the charge for?
No, not at all. So it's just part of like a normal thing that you get. So that's why Azure Storage has a high number of durability. So that let's say something were to happen and the storage cluster where this one is stored just fails and just dies and this goes away, you won't notice because in the back end there are certain DNS changes that Microsoft will make to be pointing over to this other copy over here while they are recreating another copy on another storage cluster, so that they're always 3. So it's just to help the durability and to ensure that this is durable storage. Because the worst thing that can happen for any cloud provider, what's the worst thing that can happen for the business of any cloud provider is a loss of data. Imagine that damage. Say, oh, we trusted Microsoft to store our data and all our data got lost. We're out of business. That's not good for them. So you have no option for no redundancy. You always get redundancy. There's 3 copies. That's LRS. What about there's another option? Let's go back to that. What other option do we have? We have GRS and RAGRS. If I do that, let me show you, because there's another option that, so there's another option which I was looking for. The reason is because, again, that leads me to a topic that I forgot to cover yesterday. Remember I talked about availability zones when we talked about the global infrastructure. Just remember that availability zones is not yet available in every region. I think it's not yet available in UK West. So if I do Azure regions, and so just be aware of that because I forgot to mention that yesterday. If I go Azure regions and I go to that documentation, you see the map of all the Azure regions. And one of the things I know that it's very difficult to see, and this zoom option does not help in some cases. Okay, it helps in this case. So if you look at this option, you notice that there are some regions that have the white dot in them. And if you look down here, you see the white dot says availability zones. So only regions where you see the white dot are regions where availability zones are currently available. where you can select, I want to deploy into this region availability zone 1, 2, or 3. So what they're doing is they're still building out more data centers in the other regions to ensure that they roll availability zones out globally. So it's not yet available in everywhere. You can see it's available in UK South, but it's not yet available in UK West. So that's why I wasn't seeing the other option. So let's go back here and let me change this back to UK South that I know has availability zones. And now I can see zone redundant storage. So that's the other option. If you have a region that supports availability zone at the moment, you can specify zone redundant storage. And zone redundant storage, what it's going to do is, if I go back to this diagram, it's going to take um, a copy in the zone, another copy in this zone, another copy in this zone. And not until after these 3 copies are successfully stored will the Azure Storage Service send a reply back to say everything is done. So until all these 3 are stored, it's not going to send a reply back. So instead of putting them across different storage clusters within a single zone, it's going to spread them across different storage clusters across different zones. So that way you can survive data center failure and stuff. So that's ZRS. Then we have the GRS. That's ZRS that I just described. But let's go back a bit. So let's talk about the third one, and then we'll talk about the final one, and then it's the GRS, Geo Redundant Storage. What Geo Redundant Storage would do is it's going to do, essentially, let me help you to make this easy. So GRS, or Geo Redundant Storage, equals to LRS across 2 regions. To make it simple for you, it's LRS across 2 regions. So what's going to do is it's going to take a copy of your data and make it, so it's going to go 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, across 3 separate storage clusters, and then it's going to do to the paired region. So this is where the paired region component comes in. So if you're using UK South, the paired region of UK South is UK West. If you're using West Europe, the paired region of West Europe is North Europe. So whatever region that you've selected is going to use the paired region, because that's not going to break data residency and compliance laws. And it's going to replicate your data across to 3 separate clusters over here. Now, the way that this one works is that this will be a synchronous replication. So once it's fully written these 3 copies, it sends a reply back to the client to say, job done. And in the back end, it's going to be replicating these ones across to the other region. So this one is asynchronous, because otherwise, if it has to wait for all these 3, that will be too much delay. So it's going to write this one very quickly. And once it's finished with that, sends a reply back to say job done. And then it's going to make copies of those remotely. And then finally, we have array GRS. So the thing with GRS is that it's good, but all this replication that we're talking about, it's not for your purpose, it's for Microsoft's purpose. If there were to be a failure, they can recover your data. Now, some people go, if I have 3 copies over in West Europe, I want to be able to take advantage of that. That's where the final option comes in. The final option is read access GRS. So which means it's still GRS, but they're going to give you read access to this other copy. So they're going to give you read access to this other copy. And you can see the way that that works, because that was what I selected when I did mine initial storage. So if I go over here, if I go on the geo replication, number 1 is going to hopefully show me the regions that I'm currently using. So you can see I have a primary region and I have a secondary region, and it can show me my storage endpoints. And you notice that my storage endpoint is going to give me the primary and the secondary. So for example, for my blob service endpoint, that's a primary. If I want to access the read-only copy, I can use this secondary endpoint. And I can use that to access the one that's in UK West, because I'm using UK South. And it's just going to give you the endpoint for the secondary, so you get read access. If you just select GRS, you don't get the secondary endpoint. They exist, but only for Microsoft. In case there's a disaster, they can recover your data for you. But if you want to read access to that, then you can enable this, so that you get read access to that. The advantage of what many people use that for is if you're running something like a SQL report or something like that, you can use that to offload some load away, right, from your primary storage. So rather than running the report on this database over here or this NoSQL database over here, you can be running that on the read-only copy that's over here. Okay, so I'll keep quiet then. We've gone for a very long time. So